My name is Larry Kraft. I'm a member of the Holocaust Memorial Center's Board of Directors. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. I would first like to thank Myrna and Spencer Partridge, who generously made this evening possible. I would also like to thank this evening's other supporters, the PNC Foundation and Lori and Dal Ashman, who made a gift in memory of Max Marston. Max's daughters and friends are here tonight, and so are many friends of the Partridges. And now, let me introduce our special guest speaker. Arthur Berger was the senior official at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for almost 16 years, retiring in 2016. He worked on the museum's international and diplomatic relations, outreach, and public relations programs. He frequently spoke on the Holocaust history in the United States and overseas. Before joining the museum, Mr. Berger directed public relations and communications at the American Jewish Committee, and then at the American Committee for the Weizmann Institute of Science, both in New York City. Previously, in a 25-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, Mr. Berger served in Israel, Uganda, Ethiopia, Brazil, and the Netherlands. As a Middle East issue spokesman at the Department of State, he was honored as Speaker of the Year by then Secretary of State, George Shultz. He retired as a senior Foreign Service officer in 1995. A graduate of the Yeshiva University, Mr. Berger received a master's degree from Howard University with a focus on Africa. He continued his postgraduate studies at Washington, D.C. Consortium of Universities, researching political leadership in Africa and the Middle East. He was born in Rhode Island, is married, has 2 adult sons, 2 granddaughters, and a grandson. It is truly our honor and privilege to have Arthur Berger here with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming him to the Holocaust Memorial Center.
Thank you, Larry. And thank you all for coming here this evening. It really is my honor being here with you this evening. To be able to talk about American diplomacy in the 1930s and 40s really makes me think a lot about the world today. But I'm not going to go into today's issues. But we should take a look at the history because we can learn so much from that period of time. Following World War I, the United States became entirely isolationist. It was isolationist at the level of the president, the Congress, the media, business, and the general population. No one wanted to be involved. And if you remember, the United States only got involved in the First World War in the last year of that war. But because of that isolationism, Congress passed in 1924 the Immigration and Nationality Act, which severely restricted immigration in the United States. Most of the leadership in our Congress, not all of them, but most of them, felt that there were just too many people from countries that could not contribute greatly to the greatness of the United States. And they were talking about people from Southern Europe, from Italy, from Greece, but most especially that massive immigrants that came from Eastern Europe, the Jews. They were the other of that day. Now, the worldwide depression in 1929 contributed greatly to The sense that if we let more people come into the United States, we're not going to have any jobs for, as some congressmen called it in those days, the real Americans. Well, President Roosevelt came into power on March 4th, 1933. It was the last president to come in March, be inaugurated in March. After that, it was the January 20th inauguration. And coinciding with his coming into power, a new leader came in Germany, Adolf Hitler, in 1933, except he didn't win an election. He was the compromise candidate. He was going to bring peace to Germany. Now, what he did immediately was to consolidate power, created a state of terror, imprisoned his political opposition, attacked the media, and he began the isolation and the dehumanization of Jews, because Jews were considered the cause of all evil. Now, Jewish conspiracies were widespread, not just in Germany, not just in Europe, but as they would say in the Music Man, right here in River City. Detroit was a hotbed of anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories against Jews. Some very prominent people. Henry Ford. Not only did he run the Dearborn Independent, which really increased hatred against Jews, but he also took the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and rewrote it in several volumes and called it the International Jew. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister in Germany, thought this was a great thing. And he had it translated into German and showed it to Hitler, who was really proud. Wow, an American believes just like we do. Then there was Father Charles Hoffman, Charles Lindbergh, who started the America First operation. Now, the power that they showed was not just the power of dictatorship, not just the power of speech, but the power of propaganda. If you tell a lie, Goebbels said many times, people will begin to believe it. And he said, Hitler even said this, propaganda in the hands of a powerful person is an incredible weapon. Well, the stereotypes were believed. Minorities lost their rights, and the democratic institutions, the few that were left from Weimar Germany, were destroyed. Now, how did the United States react to all of this? Well, let's take a look at a short video of our Secretary of State at the time, Cordell Hall.
After a wave of stormtrooper attacks on Jews, American public pressure mounted for Secretary of State Cordell Hall to protest the persecutions. Hall argued that outside interference in German affairs would only aggravate the situation. He tried to neutralize calls for action. In late March 1933, worried about a large protest rally planned for New York City, Hall cabled the U.S. Embassy in Berlin seeking news that would have a calming effect. A cable from Berlin reported, "The phase of physical mistreatment of Jews may be considered virtually terminated for the present at least." But that same cable announced a new phase of persecution. Nazis had begun firing Jews from government posts. Hull told Jewish leaders only that the violence was said to be over. He released the same less than complete statement to the press.
Well, when you had this kind of expression of feeling, what were people going to believe? The leadership in our government was saying that the problems were almost over, things were getting better, and very soon everybody went back to their own work. But in Germany, Jews became the scapegoats, and many Jews in Germany tried to find a way to leave. But where could they go? Nobody wanted them. It was hard to get visas. The American immigration system was so restrictive that there were very few people that could come into the United States. There were a total of 54,000 legal visas that people could get from the United Kingdom. That was the largest number from any one country. Germany was 27,000. And within a few years, there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people going to American embassies all over Europe begging for a life-saving visa, because they knew if they got one to the United States, if they landed in the United States, they would be safe. But the United States did not want refugees, and especially not Jewish refugees. The motivations were many. Anti-Semitism was part of it, isolationism was another, fear of losing jobs. Remember, the Depression went on for quite some time, but there was especially that fear of the other. People are going to change the way America is. And in Germany, things were changing. By 1935, at Nuremberg, Hitler staged not only one of the largest rallies, but it was also a militaristic rally. The Nuremberg laws decided in Germany, Hitler said, we are a nation of laws. He tried to compare himself to the leadership of the United States and other democratic countries. The Nuremberg laws took away all rights and citizenship from Jews, the few that were left. U.S. reporters reported on what was happening. They wrote the stories in all of the news media. Now, many of them, like Dorothy Thompson, Howard Chase Smith, William Shirer, and Edward R. Murrow, reported accurately and fully, and even where there was censorship, they were able to get enough information through so that Americans in every city in the United States knew what was happening in Germany. But then Roosevelt spoke. Let's see the short video.
In North Carolina, the Asheville Citizen wrote of Germany's Jews, "They can hope for the overthrow of Hitler, but they cannot hope that this will come soon enough to save them from the fate which has engulfed them." The story of the anti-Jewish laws was overshadowed in American newsreels by the flexing of Nazi military muscle at Nuremberg.
Backed by this power, Hitler waits, while Germany grows more powerful.
The American people had plentiful and mostly accurate news about the disaster that faced the Jews in Germany, but information did not provoke action or change official policy. The threat of an international conflict loomed larger than the Nazis' real war against the Jews that had already begun. The United States was determined to avoid both wars.
Despite what happens in continents overseas, the United States of America shall and must remain as long ago the father of our country prayed that it might remain, unentangled and free.
Very important words, unentangled and free. The United States was determined to stay away from the problems. And as time went on, by 1938, you had the Munich Olympics, the Berlin Olympics in 1936, which America participated in spite of the fact that a vast majority of American news media editorialized against American participation. But also in 1938, there was what was called the Munich Conference, and Prime Minister Chamberlain of Britain agreed that we have to work with Hitler. We can make sure that there will not be war, but there will be peace in our time. By November of 1938, Hitler was convinced that the United States and other countries would not take any Jews because he saw what happened at the Evian Conference in July, just a few months earlier. 34 nations met, and none of them, including the United States, committed to changing their laws. Only the Dominican Republic said, we will take 100,000 people, but 100,000 Jews did not want to go to the Dominican Republic, nor could they find passage on ships to go there. So most of the Jews stayed, not just in Germany, but in the rest of Europe. And FDR took a look at what happened in Germany November 9th and 10th, 1938, at the Kristallnacht pogroms, and saw what was happening, and he saw the pressure upon him to say something. Say something, Mr. President. 5 days passed with front-page newspaper reports, with radio reports every single day documenting the mass pogroms, the killing of Jews, the incarceration of over 25,000 men and boys, and yet the president took 5 days to speak. And what did he do? He recalled the American ambassador from Germany. At that time, it was considered a little bit more than it would be today, but it was really just a slap on the wrist. It was not a serious diplomatic problem for Germany. Within Germany, in Germany, Greater Germany had become already Austria, it was absorbed, part of Czechoslovakia as well. There were several consulates. One of the consulates was in Austria, in Vienna. John Wiley see his picture over here, was the Consul General in Vienna. He told his staff, he said, even though we may not be able to give everyone who comes in satisfaction that they can get entry into the United States, there were a total of almost 29,000 visas allowed per year from the greater Germany and Austria. He said, even though, we have to show them dignity. We have to tell them that we're trying to do something. We can't make them feel like they are dehumanized the way the Germans want them to feel. He was unusual. Most other American diplomats made fun of the people seeking visas to the United States. Now, there was one example, though, of an American diplomat in France. In the next picture, you see Hiram Bingham IV, who was in Marseille. He came there in 1940. He was a junior consular official. He, together with the next picture of Darian Fry, who worked for the Emergency Rescue Committee, had permission to give people of exceptional merit about 250 visas to the United States. Together, they helped over 2,000 people, mainly Jews, people like Marc Chagall, to get out of German-occupied France. And even though that part of France was Vichy France, the United States still had a consulate there. They got them over the border into Spain, then to neutral Portugal, and to the United States. They were brave. They were part of the righteous among the nations. And unfortunately, there weren't very many. Now, the next picture you take a look at is someone who was not an American citizen until really very late in his life. Jan Karski was a young Polish diplomat who left with the Polish government in exile to England. And he knew what was happening in his home country. He was smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. He went to a transit camp where Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto were being deported to their deaths in Treblinka. And then he got smuggled out to England. He spoke to Anthony Eden, and then he went to the United States, and he met with FDR. And he told the president exactly what he had seen. He said, Mr. President, I've seen they're killing men, women, children. They're going to kill all of the Jews of Europe. And he said, the president, and he mimicked how the president used to smoke like this, and he said, Mr. President, he said, Mr. Karski, I understand what you're saying, but nobody could be that brutal. But we will see what we can do. Did the president do anything? Not much. In April of 1943, April 19th to be exact, as the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was taking place, in Bermuda, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met to try to figure out what they could do about Jewish refugees. And that was a total failure. But during 1943, there were a number of things that were moving. But there was one person, in the next photograph, you will see a picture of Breckinridge Long, an infamous American diplomat. He comes from the Long family of Louisiana. He ran for Senate, and he lost. Very unusual. He was a friend, though, of President Roosevelt and supported him in the election campaigns. But he sent an interdepartmental memo that was sent also to consulates all over the world. And he said, and I'll quote from this, "We can delay and effectively stop for a temporary period of indefinite length the number of immigrants into the United States. We can do this by simply advising our consuls, put every obstacle in the way, require additional evidence, resort to various administrative devices, which would," and this is a quote, "would postpone and postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of visas." He made no secret of his anti-Semitism. So in November of that year, November of 1943, as the pressure was mounting within the Jewish community and in other communities in the United States for the United States government to do something, Breckinridge Long met before committees of Congress that were discussing the possible setting up of a refugee association, a refugee committee, a refugee government organization that would help Jews, save Jews in Europe. And Breckinridge Long lied to the members of Congress. It was a closed hearing, but as we know, most testimonies in Congress get out eventually. And what he said was, We have in the State Department helped Jews everywhere. We have helped hundreds of thousands of Jews come into the United States over the last 10 years. There's no other country that has helped Jews as much as we have. We really care about them. And everybody knew how openly anti-Semitic he was. Well, at the same time, within the Treasury Department, there were several mid-level officers who said, we can no longer take what the State Department officials are doing at every level, mid-level, lower level, and at the most senior levels of the State Department. Now, if any of you have ever traveled to Cuba, you know you have to get a special license to use US dollars there, or a group that you go with. Well, in those days, you had to get a special license, say, if an NGO, like HIAS, or the Joint Distribution Committee, wanted to send money to Switzerland, a neutral country, for these organizations to use with refugees. The State Department had to administer it. And the State Department stood in the way of the Treasury, even after the licenses were granted, even after the President approved of licenses. Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau, together with President Roosevelt, talked about what they were going to do. And there was a mid-level officer within the Treasury Department, John Peely, together with Josiah Dubois, who crafted a 17-page memo, first to the Secretary of Treasury, and they asked him to give it to the President of the United States. The title of it scared Morgenthau. It said, on the complicity of the United States government in the murder of Europe's Jews. And they said in that memo that if the United States government, if the President didn't do something right away, forever, in every generation, you will be blamed for the murder of these Jews. Well, in the next picture, John Peely was appointed by President Roosevelt. The memo was written in late December of 1943. In January of 1944, President Roosevelt did what he could have done the year before, and the year before, and the year before. To sign, we know, the President signed lots of executive orders. President Roosevelt refused to sign an executive order about the Jews until this point, in January 1944, where he set up the War Refugee Board and made John Peely the executive director of it. And he said that the State Department and all other agencies of the United States government would have to obey what he said. Well, in the next photo, you see one example of what the War Refugee Board did. Ruth Gruber, and some of you may have heard of her, she died just a couple of years ago at 105. She's the woman in the middle, smiling with the general's cap on. She was a photographer, she was an adventurer, she worked for Harold Ickes in the Interior Department, and she was appointed temporarily, commissioned as a general, to go on a troop ship to Europe and to bring back a full load of Jewish refugees to the United States. This was supposed to be the first of many ships bringing Jewish refugees to freedom towards the end of the war. Well, it was the only ship. It was the only ship where they were taken to Fort Oswego, New York, and they were incarcerated there until the end of the war. Eventually they were allowed to stay in the United States, but the agreement was originally that they would go back to their homes. But as we know, what homes did they have? Now, in the next photo, with Roe Wallenberg, who became an honorary American citizen. Roe Wallenberg in 1944, July of 1944, went to Budapest with money from the War Refugee Board. He was sponsored by the United States government, even though he was a Swedish diplomat, even though he came from the wealthiest of Swedish families, even though he did not have to put himself in danger. And he, together with other diplomats in Budapest, saved hundreds of thousands of Jews who otherwise would have been murdered by Nazis and by their collaborators in Hungary, as more than half of the Jewish population had already been killed. Well, the next photo, the last one, James Grover McDonald. How many of you have ever heard of James Grover McDonald? I think I see one hand, Guy Stern's hand, that has heard of it. James Grover McDonald was League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in the early 1930s, and in 1935, December 1935, he quit in disgust because no one would help the Jews. He negotiated with Roosevelt. He negotiated with the Pope. He went to Hitler and he spoke to Hitler in fluent German. And he looked like an Aryan. And he said, I have to do something on behalf of the Jews. Well, he did. He finally went on to, at the end of the war, Harry Truman appointed him to the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry on Palestine. And together with his American colleagues and with the British ones, whom he forced to go to a DP camp with him and to hear displaced persons. And McDonald told the British, you tell them they can't go to Palestine. And all 12 members of this committee agreed to allow these hundreds of thousands, 150,000 Jews to go to Palestine. And the British government refused. They kept to their white paper restrictions on Jews going to Palestine. So James Grover McDonald was appointed the first U.S. ambassador to Israel. At the end of his tour of 3 years, he made a statement. He called it a credo. This is what he wrote. I'll just read one paragraph from there because it really tells you something about him and about what others could have done. To me, the threat of Jewish extermination in Germany was a threat also to all Christians and to all freedom of religion and to all democratic ideals and principles. The fact that I, a blonde Aryan, offspring of Scotch-Canadian and Midwest American stock, a teacher and student by profession and inclination, became a champion for Jewish aspiration and equal human rights. It was an irresistible call. I had to do this, he said. I had to help them because the heroic struggles of the Jews against 2,000 years of oppression, the conviction that the issues today were far greater than the rescue of Jews from Hitler's concentration camps, these elements entered into my decision to try to help them. Christianity and democracy were, I thought, at stake. And then he writes, today, 1951, as he's leaving his post in Israel, those same issues confront a free world, though it is not today the Jews who are the main victim of totalitarian threat. So how do we conclude this? How do we go from here to Bruce's art? How do we take a look at American diplomacy and say, it wasn't focused on saving Jews? And until 1944, with few exceptions, in the American political establishment, there were very few people, and certainly not those who had the most influence, to do something. Anti-Semitism was rife. Isolationism was everywhere. Senior officials at the State Department stymied the Treasury. And today we understand the power of propaganda and how a dictator can use it to make hate and lies. Have many of you read Philip Roth's book, The Plot Against America? Or Sinclair Lewis's book that I'm rereading now, It Can't Happen Here? If you haven't, it's worth rereading. Now, Bruce's art shows us the mass destruction that can come if we don't stand up to evil. During the Holocaust, the vast majority of people weren't perpetrators. They didn't go around murdering their neighbors. They were bystanders. They let it happen by not standing up and speaking. And Bruce's art and our knowledge of history are calls to action for all of us in a world that is troubled. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Amazing. My art is meant to make you feel what happens when people lose humanity. They lose their minds. Evil is always lurking. Unfortunately, it's a part of humanity. These are portraits that were made by slave laborers at Auschwitz. These are the faces of people we didn't know. This is the story of 6 million Jews who were murdered who we never knew. They are portraits of men, women, normal citizens, Jewish citizens of Eastern Europe, people just like us, who were degraded and murdered and forgotten to history. Woman sleeping. This man could have been your grandmother's brother. My art is very personal to me. and I can't express what it means to me to be able to show you my art. First and foremost, Rabbi Elie Meyerfeld and Sarah Saltzman welcomed me like family to the Holocaust Memorial Center. This is a truly world-class museum. And an incredible special thank you to my extremely dear friends, Myrna and Spencer Partridge, who have given me the privilege of showing you my artwork in Detroit. My work is about my heritage and that of my grandchildren, my granddaughter Rosie. It's also about your children and the future. Narrowly, this is an unknown artist's interpretation reflecting upon the exterminations of Jews in Europe. It's about the future of the Jewish people, and it's about the survival of Israel. It's about the dangers facing and the protections needed to preserve every secular democracy. I have asked these questions for decades, and because of my sister Nina, I've traveled to Eastern Europe to see for myself what was brought 80 years ago, what happened to my relatives who perished and who never had the joys of raising families, who died at the hands of fellow humans. After that experience, I had dark thoughts about humanity and nightmares for weeks, and even deeper concerns about our future. And it's those nightmares about the Holocaust that have inspired my art and that I brought to the Holocaust Memorial Center. This photographs my grandfather, David Neubauer, my father, Max Gendelman, who was a sniper, American sniper in the Battle of the Bulge, who escaped from 3 prisoner war camps with a deserter from the German Luftwaffe. And this is my niece and I in Ukraine. I thank you for your time because it's really all we have. I'm honored to have this exhibition, and I will do my best to make your time worthwhile. In the Nazi, anti-Jewish hatred, Jews were first made to be others. Then forced from their schools and jobs, their writers, artists, and scientists were ridiculed, and the German press, and then the judiciary, and then the legislature were bullied into silence. The carefully organized mass hatred of propaganda and thuggery allowed people to sometimes look away. As books were banned and then burned, Jews were prohibited from traveling, Jews were rounded up and placed in ghettos, Jews were murdered in pits with bullets to the back of their heads, and then in the industrial human death factories that harvested the lives and body parts and minds, all for a philosophy of words that set one group of people superior to others, words which were carefully uttered by clever, power-hungry, narcissistic men intent upon the total elimination of the Jewish race and all traces that ever existed, and a means to help achieve their world power. Words that were crafted by propaganda, lies, historical biases, dished up to people who couldn't or didn't want to know the truth, and then lies of easy answers and racial scapegoating, creating the other out of ignorance. These are the methods of power-hungry evil men, authoritarians of all stripes. When applied to governments and religious centers, they follow a playbook, and it will always work unless it is stopped, before it becomes tragic and catastrophic. We listened to and spoke to now old people who were there when the world went mad. Human faces described the babies they saw being held by their feet and swung so their heads spattered against trees. They explained this was to save bullets. They described being forced at gunpoint to strip the dying victims of their clothes before pushing them into ditches and then pushing more dying naked victims on top of them. We saw the ruins of a mechanized system of extermination that had been built by the people who would be tortured and murdered after they could no longer be of use. I sought for myself to capture through photography, oil painting, installations, and sculpture, to remind myself and anyone who will listen that it was only yesterday that a civilized society of laws, religious institutions, art, and science, a civil nation just like ours, followed a demonic leader into depravity that defies understanding yet must be understood. And now, There's almost no one left alive who was a witness to this genocide of 6 million Jews. The policy of Judenfrei was 98.5% successful in Eastern Europe. Jews, people of the book, taught to be the light amongst the nations, wiped out on the continent. I believe that art can be an inspiration to young and old people searching for answers to truth, humanity, and a more righteous future. Museums like this one and Holocaust remembrance and educational institutions have informed, educated, and inspired millions, and developed programming for every conceivable audience who will listen. Art always brings new messages to generations. Every viewer brings their own psyche and experiences to absorb the artist's intent. I hope that broadly, post-witness Holocaust art can serve as a way of preserving experiences. In a book called Artist Therapy, the authors write, "We need help in finding honor in some of our worst experiences, and art is there to lend a social expression that can assist in reaching new audiences. After all, to experience art does not require language, reading skills, books, classes, or teachers. Art, if good, can affect a viewer deep in his or her heart and mind, and become a permanent marker of a message of a certain period of time, a cultural reflection to inspire goodness through portraying evil. It is my intent and hope that my work will cause you some emotional unease and reflection. I aim to have you, the art viewer, reflect on the experiences of those who were subjected to unspeakable suffering, starvation, sadistic psychological torture, medical science, human experimentation. So for the 1 in 1,000 that survive, explain that all that is left is the basic will to survive." This is a poem by my dear friend Bob Miller, who accompanied me on this trip. "Let me tell you what I saw. I need to tell you what I saw. Innocent men and women shot and pushed into ditches. Babies smashed against trees. People stripped of clothes and dignity. Humanity, already dead like the perpetrators. Dead inside first, eventually dead for all to see who looked. But I am still alive to tell. Whether or not I want to remember, I do and I must tell. What is left for an old man to do but tell? Here is where it happened. I was not a hero. I was not a collaborator. We were all victims, even the heroes, even the collaborators, even the perpetrators. All of us victim of our humanity, the good, the bad, the dreadful, all by and to humans. Here is where it happened. Please listen to me without judging. You were not there. No one can understand who was not there. I was there. And I understand enough to know that no one can understand. But do not think that because it's incomprehensible, it did not happen. Because it did, and I was there, and I was pulled by scum with guns to take off the clothes of the dead and almost dead, and cover the dead and dying with more dead and dying. And then with dirt which moved, and more dirt, until there was silence, and I was never the same. I remember some things so vividly, this day and others like it. A happy poem about nature that I memorized when I was 8. Please listen to what my heart remembers, and forgive yourself for being no better than me." And that was said to a man who was 17, a boy who was 17, who was conscripted by the Nazis, is now 92. And I had the great fortune of spending 2 days with Father Patrick Dubois, Catholic priest from Paris, who I know has been in this museum. Father Dubois had us talk to 2 men who were witnesses and describe for the first time to people who weren't part of his foundation what they saw. Father Dubois, who's been on 60 Minutes, I'm sure many of you have seen him. He has the demeanor of the Dalai Lama. He's a scholar. He's responsible for, over the last 30 years, finding 2,100 massacre sites of Jews in Eastern Europe, places where 2.1 million Jews were murdered. His book, Holocaust by Bullets, and is a brand new book that just came out. I highly recommend everybody read it. At one of the places we went, a small town where 450 Jews were murdered in a pit, we said Kaddish, it was solemn, and this man comes out running after us. He was a neighboring farmer, And he said, don't listen to that man. Everybody knows that that man is a liar. The Jews were not killed here. The Jews stole our money. They all left in 1939. There were no Jews that lived here. So I called this man the denier, and he was screaming and yelling at us to leave. We went to the Ukraine and went to the remaining synagogue in the Ukraine, in Lvov, Ukraine. And we got the key. We went into this dilapidated building that was used as a Russian boxing club and now is derelict. And in comes this man. He sort of looks at us, he puts on his tallis and tefillin, and he brings out his iPhone. And on his iPhone in Ukrainian, he was reading Hebrew transliteration, and he said the evening prayers and davening. He comes up to my brother-in-law and I and our guide, said, "You Jews?" He said, "Yes." Puts on the tefillin on us, and we said the prayers. And after that, he explained that he knew he was Jewish growing up. His parents, but they didn't practice. His parents were from Russia. They were brought as bureaucrats. They were accountants. They were brought to this town to help administer the Soviet occupation. And when the wall came down, he decided that he would learn traditions of Judaism, and he would come to this site by himself a couple times a week to pray for the men and women who were no longer able to come for themselves. So in this photograph, I call him the last Jew of Lvov. This is a next photograph is a photograph from one of the women's barracks at Birkenau. The women were slave laborers, but they were also sex slaves, and this was one of the barracks where they were locked in. This photograph I call Portal. It's the top bunk in one of the barracks, one of the women's barracks in Birkenau, and they were. You'll see my diorama, but on the top bunk they would be stacked 8, 10, 12 across. This was their bed to lay on the wood, but they had this view to look out, this tree. And the next picture is one of the people I went with, Debbie Zemmel, whose father was a survivor of Birkenau and was actually a rabbi in Detroit, Rabbi Rosenthal. And she came with us, and I caught this picture of her looking into the barracks, thinking about her father's life as a slave laborer. This next photograph is, I call the DKA. It's the Dom Katholika Association in a little town called Bolachov. Bolachov was a town in 1939 of 7,800 people. 4,800 were Jews. 41 survived the war. This is a town where my grandfather, who saw his picture, David Neubauer, came from. Of his entire extended family of 100 people, he was the only one to survive the Holocaust. And the only reason was because before World War I, he left and he emigrated to the United States and then to Palestine as an apprentice carpenter. In this, there's an incredible book called The Lost, The Search for 6 out of 6 Million by Daniel Mendelsohn, who's a professor at Bard College. And he describes, by coincidence, this exact same town, and his relatives are from this town. And my sister, who is a Jewish day school librarian, did an enormous amount of research. And we found out in this building, in the first Action in Bolachov, 950 people were rounded up. We believe, including my great-grandparents and my grandfather's 2 younger sisters. They were brought to this building. It's about a 5,000 square foot building at the rec center. Everyone was Orthodox, of course. They were first made to strip all their clothes. They were brought in this room. The SS set up a room where they raped the girls that they wanted to rape. They made the Orthodox rabbi dance around on stage with naked 12 and 13-year-old girls, and when anyone would stop, they would shoot them. And after 2.5 days of torture, they marched from naked through town, and they were buried in the Tonawanda forest. The other thing we did in Bolachov is we went to the cemetery. And as I'm sure you know, as psychological torture, the Nazis would try to eliminate all trace of the Jewish identity, and they would destroy the synagogues, they destroy the cemeteries, and they would take the gravestones, they would put them in town, and they would drive their trucks over, people would step on the gravestones, and then they would send the local men and boys into town with sledgehammers to break up all of the gravestones. And there have been Jews in this town for about 900 years, and a lot since the late 1400s. And everyone in this town, there were 4,800 Jews in 1939. If you go back, there's this big cemetery. I calculated there were at least 25,000 people that had been buried there over 500 years. There are 81 gravestones left. And our guide who was with us, who has a PhD in Jewish history, who's not Jewish, he's a professor in Warsaw, and we went at 4 or 5 in the afternoon. I wanted to take pictures at dusk. And he started taking pictures. He said, well, I'll just walk around, see if I can see anything of interest. And he goes to the first gravestone, which is the one to the left of the tree, standing there, and he starts screaming, and we come back, and he says, you won't believe this. This is David Dubois, maternal grandfather's grave. And he would read the Yiddish, Hebrew letters in German, the Yiddish, and my sister and brother-in-law and niece and I said Kaddish. And to me, it was this miracle. How could it be this one gravestone, one out of 25,000, the first one he went to, it's like the Hanukkah miracle, where there's a little bit of oil left. And that's good. So I did this painting. There's photographs in this painting you'll see in the big room, and I call this the DKA. And in the building, there was a fire after the Nazis left, but the building in this town is still the same. The roof had collapsed. This town still has like 2,500 people, of course no Jews. They're still dirt poor. Only outdoor plumbing. You have to bring your own toilet paper because they're so poor they'll steal the toilet paper. And I did this painting of this burned out support ember that's charred. And each one of those bricks represents one of the 950 people, and each one's its own little painting, its own little landscape, thinking about each one of the people who were tortured in that. And when I came back from the trip, from Auschwitz, when I looked and went to Birkenau, and I know many of you have been there, but I was overwhelmed by the scale. And I went to the edge of it, and I looked back, and I saw row after row after row of these chimneys that were chimneys remaining in the barracks. And I sat and thought, to me it looked like gravestones, say, at Arlington. But then I realized these people, no one had gravestones. These were unknown men and women who died there. But the chimneys that they made by their own hands under forced labor by the Nazis remained, and they were like lone soldiers standing there. And I decided I wanted to memorialize these chimneys as a symbol for the men and women who died there. And I started painting these. You'll see them, you've seen them in the other room. And I made this artist statement about the chimneys from the viewpoint of one of these slave laborers. Beaten, sucked dry by darkness, I build brick by brick, monuments to the women, men, slaves, Jews, lives extinguished, along with the lives of their children never to be born. I'm a lucky one, not yet gassed or incinerated. I am dying on a slower clock. The ticking of starvation, exhaustion, and despair. We built these museums of depravity with no hope that any Jews would survive to remember who we were. From the edge of this hell, I can feel the chaotic madness. The only color and light is from the trains and the furnaces. We are all combined in flames. Our souls fight to escape, to rise. But the heat and hate consume the embers of our souls. I could never have imagined that someday my chimney, built by my hand, could become a reminder of what did happen when men closed their eyes to evil. How they must have thought that what we needed was Herzl's dream, a nation of our own. Without the land, Jews cannot be safe. And with the land, Jews must always be able to fend off destruction. God, please hear me. And in these paintings, when I decided to paint them, I view myself as a landscape painter, and I knew this was a tricky subject to try to paint. So I didn't want to paint it had to be this big, powerful painting. And I used a trowel because that was the tool that the slave laborers used to make the chimneys. And in the bottom, you'll see in the other room, you'll see in the bottom, it's all chaos. The movement, the paint is thick and it's dark. and you get trapped in it. But there's a horizon line, and normally in the landscape you have a beautiful sky. Well, here the skies are black and dark, but yet there's other colors in there. And on the horizon, frequently you'll see the trains coming in and the crematorium in the distance. And then, when I was working on those paintings and I came back, I was having nightmares. And I had these visions of emotion, these feelings from doing this. And I painted the next three paintings directly from the visions I had in my nightmares. And from the barbed wire edge of this hell, I feel and see an impossible chaos. The smell, the choking fumes, ash from the bodies, darken the sky and fall like rain. The only color and light we can see is from the trains and the furnaces. The gassed Jews are incinerated in flames, souls fighting to escape and rise. But the heat and hate dissipate any hope for redemption. I have a fading will to survive. I know too will end up in the furnace. My family is gone, I am next. Why has God failed me? And then you'll see this very large painting, 8 feet high, 12 feet wide, 550 pounds of oil paint. And it's a aerial view, an imaginary aerial view of where the Jews suffered. It's a sunset landscape painting. The filtered sunlight is overpowered by the remains of the furnaces, reflecting on the barracks roofs. But look at the German precision, the efficient industrial scale. It's their own labor supply of Jews to burn. An artist starts with a blank canvas. Power-lusting men can create their own scenes. I believe art should send a message to remember those in our families who were murdered we never knew. Almost no one is left alive who ever knew them. This art is meant to convey deep personal emotion that we're all here as individuals and as a society prisoners of our histories. And I present this exhibition for both me and you to feel, remember, and be vigilant about current and future dangers. Short video.
Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
In a world filled with ignorance and hate, fear is a natural and appropriate reaction. We are genetically programmed to protect ourselves. We are also social creatures, and we aggregate in tribal groups based upon family, nationality, religion, and economic interests. It's part of the human condition to prize individual liberties, while at the same time being willing to sacrifice them for the greater good of the tribe. It has been said that where there's a balance between these competing interests, there is peace. But when people are scared enough, there is no balance. When people don't have factual information and or the education to place it in historical context, powerful people co-opt minds, sublimate notions of the importance of the individual, and become complacent to warriors in the focused pursuit of vanquishing others. In the United States, our Constitution balances the dangers of the mob against the inherent human nature that power gets abused by individuals. But when decent voices do not speak out because they are bullied, desensitized, lied to, or uneducated, or don't have access to real information, or are not protected by political and legal systems, or are threatened with violence or death, as the Nazis proved, genocide is the result. Always. The past is done, but be very careful, because the future is at risk. Don't look away. Thank you.
questions. It's very good to see so many of our friends and new friends here tonight. We have time for some questions now for Bruce and for Arthur. So we have some people here who are circulating. If you'll raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone over to Zach. If you want to ask them to come to the aisle there, and we can have them ask the questions for you.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
In regards to the diplomat, I understand that FDR had an opportunity to bomb the camps in 1944, and was that decision made by him or others in the government?
It's a good question. The history of that period, should we have bombed Auschwitz or not? And there are photographs, aerial photographs, taken by U.S. bombers that were flying to go to the artificial rubber and oil plants just south of Auschwitz. They literally flew over Auschwitz. They took photographs. The CIA blew them up. You see some of those photographs here and in other Holocaust museums. The question is, where did the request, because the Jewish community leadership, and especially the World Jewish Congress, begged the president to bomb Auschwitz. The question is, did it ever get to him? Certainly, the Assistant Secretary of War, John McCloy, wrote a letter back to the World Jewish Congress and said it would divert us from our war aims. And what we really want to do is destroy the Nazi war machine, and that will save lives. He clearly didn't want to do that, and from what I understand from new history, there's a new book about FDR, Hearing the Politician by Robert Dallin that just came out, and he says in there that the question never got to Roosevelt, that McCloy, who was supposed to be the conduit, just kind of kept it to himself and to other military leaders, and they didn't think it was important to do that because they had other goals in mind.
Why did Roosevelt have such widespread American Jewish support?
Well, I think the answer to that is, I'll give you the answer that my father gave me. Because my father grew up during the Depression, and I think many of our parents, also went through that period and suffered terribly. He saved this country from disaster during the Depression. They looked at him as really the savior of America. And they saw him as the person who wanted to fight, but yet was being held back by these other forces. Turns out that his wife wanted him to get more involved and do more things for the Jews, Eleanor Roosevelt, who after Roosevelt died became a very powerful spokesperson.
See, that's a lesson. Always listen to what your wife says.
Exactly. And she knew. But it seems very much like Roosevelt was beloved by so many in the United States because of the economic revitalization of the country. A quarter of the American population was out of work.
I guess, Arthur, that it's important that we understand these things in the context of the time.
It's true. The context of the time was also that, as I said at the beginning of my talk, isolationism was rampant. The members of Congress did not want to give Roosevelt anything to do overseas. When Britain came to him for aid, he had to find back way. Lend-Lease eventually came about, but there was an isolationism legislation, the U.S. Act of Neutrality. The United States Congress demanded that the president not get involved. So it was a tough time.
Thank you.
And I'll add one other thing. Nobody was doing anything either. Nobody else, no different.
I want to thank you for a very moving presentation and your passion, especially for the art, and I understand the passion of the first presentation. My feeling is much of this was directed toward disappointment in America. It was a very fluid time from 35 to 42, as you mentioned, these many years, and I know it was difficult to put all that in one few minutes. But I think the difficulty, Roosevelt was a Democrat. I'd be curious, was the same feeling on the Republican side as you see it? And also, is there the same disappointment with England and with France and even with Germany itself for not seeing this danger building and doing something? Because as we look at America in 1935, I'm certain if we had been there, we would not have wanted to get involved in another World War I, which they could remember.
Well, it's very clear. Some of you may have seen the new movie about Churchill, The Darkest Hour. And you saw the kind of problems he had with his own faction in Parliament in trying to get support just to save British troops. Chamberlain was Prime Minister before him, and Chamberlain was the one who made the pact with Hitler that was called the Munich Agreement, thought that this would bring peace in our time. You have to take it, as Ellie said, the context of that time. People were tired of war. They did not want to get involved anymore. They thought they could compromise. They really, it wasn't like today. You can go on the internet and you can find everybody's speech that anybody has ever made and everything that they've ever written. In those days, you didn't have all of those resources. So sometimes people believed what they wanted to believe. And this happens today as well. You believe what you want to believe. And as you ask the question, were the Republicans very much like the Democrats in Congress? Yes, they were. There was, I think I quoted a Republican congressman from North Carolina who said, we don't want any more of those people because they're going to bring in their way of life, not like we Americans of the old stock, the real Americans.
Sort of like from Norway.
Kind of like from Norway.
We have a copy of my copy in the library that was published in, I believe, 1939 here in the United States. A group of scholars, Columbia University and elsewhere, said that there's no copies of Mein Kampf in an unabridged edition. People need to read what the man is saying because we need to understand he's serious. And so they published an annotated copy of Mein Kampf to be publicly available, not just for the scholars, so that people could read what he had to say. But as you say, even Roosevelt himself had trouble believing people could read that book.
Well, he had trouble believing it because he didn't see it on television. You know, we see this all the time, the barbarity around the world. You know, genocide, as Bruce said, genocide is not an isolated phenomenon. Genocide occurs in every generation. And the question is, do you see the warning signs? Genocide doesn't happen overnight. Suddenly a leader decides to kill 100,000 people. That doesn't happen. You had a build up that Rwanda, 1994, April 1994, 100 days. But there was a build up on the radio for months beforehand, talking about the Tutsi as cockroaches, unworthy of life. You take a look at some of the posters from the Nazi era and how they portrayed Jews as vermin, as ugly people who are going to bring disease and stealing money from you and controlling the world. People believe that kind of stuff.
There's lights in my eyes. Go ahead, please.
Sorry, I just had a question for the artist. Do you still have the nightmares? And if not, do you think that your art would have been as prolific if you didn't have those images emblazoned on your mind and put on the canvas?
Thank you for the question. I don't, but I am still consumed by the subject matter. Actually, from here, this exhibition is going to Krakow, Poland, and to the site of the horrors. And there's something about the Jewish festival there. This is an exhibition of the Jewish festival. But it was that overwhelming sense, sort of that passion that made me do it.
I'd like to ask you, Bruce, about your art background, beginning when you were a child and how it progressed, and how you happened to find this particular medium to express your art.
Well, so I'm an amateur artist. I've never sold anything, nor would I sell anything. I've been painting and taking pictures on and off since I was 10 years old. I had an incredible art teacher, Alan Kraft, who I still email with almost every day now. And I've always done this for myself. But after I went and had this experience and found out what happened to my great-grandparents, and spent time with Father Dubois and listened to these men and seen the enormity of Birkenau and the scale of it. It was this overwhelming thing to me. You know, I grew up as I'll say as a Zionist. I grew up with my father's stories from World War II and this incredible escape story, and growing up with his best friend, a German reserve in the Luftwaffe, and my grandparents, every bit of money they'd have, they'd send to somewhere in Israel. And I had my bar mitzvah there in 1967, so it's in my blood. And then and I've read forever. So I have a day job. I'm a lawyer by training. I'm in the insurance business, so I do this on the side. And but you know, I hit a chord with myself, and I think it resonates with many other people as well.
Thank you. Good question. Let's take a question here in the front first. Okay, go ahead. Stand up for it.
I'm just very curious as to the different emotions that you went through while you were painting these paintings.
You know, a lot of different emotions, but as I think I mentioned, I was trying to set, you know, in art, when a painter paints something, and you know, it's a reflection of what's in their mind, and I tried to put that on the canvas. And what I wanted to do was make a memorial for these men and women who were so brutally murdered and starved and tortured at Birkenau and the other camps. So at least someone tried to remember them in one painting, and then it became 9 paintings, and now it's a speech. Yeah.
Thank you for coming. We have one more over here.
I enjoyed this, but with great sorrow, that the people really that should see this will never see this. And as a Jew, having friends that don't know I'm Jewish, I realize it's a world that I have to change. What do you see from your knowledge is the tipping point that makes a switch that wakens up some of the people in this political climate today?
I think the most important thing, and I'll let Bruce give his opinion on this as well, but I think the most important thing is education. We've got to teach young people everywhere this history. Now, but what you do here in this museum is so important, because you don't just look at the history as an abstract, but you bring it back to Michigan. There are the comments of people from Michigan, the artifacts that people brought here, the uniforms, I think there was one of the Air Force bombardiers, his flight schedule. These are the kinds of things that will resonate with young people. In addition, encounters with survivors. Now, there aren't that many survivors left, unfortunately, and there's a new technology, but for any of you who have ever seen teenagers meet up with 85 or 90-year-old survivors, and then after they hear them speak, come up and hug them and want to know. And I remember when I was working at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and there was this young girl who looked like she was about 14 or 15 years old, and she came up to Bessie Godin. Some of you may have heard of her. She's spoken all over the United States. And they said, did you have a prom in your high school? And Bessie said, what are you talking about, prom? I didn't go to high school. My high school was schlepping bricks. I was a prisoner. I was a slave laborer. And this is what happened. Kids today have to learn that these kinds of experiences are not in the abstract, but these are real.
But it's not. It's certainly children. You know, I tried to emphasize in my speech about education and propaganda and information, and it gets, you know, very broadly when you have a system where the very basic pillars that hold democracy together are attacked, and they always get it. What happened in Germany can be analogous to any place, including this country. You attack the judiciary, you attack the police, if you attack the press, and you repeat lies and repeat lies and repeat lies, it all becomes very blurred and people become complacent. You know, it's the frog slowly being boiled in the pot, and then it's too late. And so you know, it's incumbent upon certainly politicians and intelligence officers and police and normal citizens to be very careful about the world and how you know, society is functioning.
If I could add one thing to what Bruce said, a good friend of mine, Ralph Begleiter, who used to be with CNN, is a professor at the University of Delaware, teaches his students communication. And he said, today, the kids get all the news that they want to get from their phones. And it's something that's been retweeted or from Facebook sent on to somebody else. They don't know what truth is anymore.
And the Russians were very effective at using that. I gave a speech in Philadelphia with a bunch of kids, and I asked, these are 6th and 8th graders, not Jewish, inner city school and a Catholic school, and I asked them to raise their hand, how many people have a cell phone? Every single person. How many people read the newspaper? You know, a handful or two. How many watch network news? A handful or two. How many get their news from Facebook? Everybody. And that's, you know, it's a lot of rumor, it's a lot of misinformation. There's no, you know, so I try to implore them, you know, take a subject matter. And if you could read every single thing written on that, there might be 3,000 articles written about a space launch. You'll have a different perspective from each of those, and try to understand the bias behind that. You know, as a lawyer, we're taught to, you know, analyze facts. And that's something that isn't done, and our educational systems here in general are so poor. And, you know, when the press is attacked and all this other stuff. So it's a great danger.
I want to thank both of you for your...
Thank you.
Thank you all.
I also want to thank, just one more minute if you don't mind, I want to thank our sponsors, Myrna and Spencer Partridge, for their insight in bringing Bruce Gendelman. I also want to thank our supporters, Lori Tal-Oshman and the PNC Foundation, for making the evening possible. Arthur, you alluded to the ongoing conversation that we're having here at the HMC about making sure this message gets out. I ask each of you to participate. Bring your families and bring your friends here. Thank you all. Have a good evening.